Hello again. Now, something that most of us carry around with us pretty much all the time is a smartphone. And smartphones these days have very good cameras in them. And I don't even know if it's possible to buy a current one that doesn't have a camera in it. So it just felt worth talking about photography with a smartphone again. I've done it before. There's at least one other podcast if you go back through the old podcasts. And I've also spoken about smartphones in some of the webinars I've given. So if you've listened to those, this will not be a new subject. But I thought it was worth talking about again because this podcast is about wildlife, adventure travel, that kind of thing. And while it's easy to get caught up in what DSLR do you need, what mirrorless camera do you need, which is what I do use for most of my photography, we shouldn't forget that we also have another camera with us most of the time, and it can be a very good one. So, for example, I will often use the panorama feature on my smartphone. So I currently have a Samsung, but I've had iPhones in the past. So whatever you're using, do have a look. Take a bit of time to look at the capabilities on the phone from a photography point of view. Usually there's a movie option as well. So I'll often use the phone for that when I'm away. So do take a look and think about the kind of photography that you do, that you might want to do, and look at what the smartphone can deliver. Because even if you're not using it as a primary camera, particularly when you're away, it is something you can use a lot for practice, and not just using the phone itself, but playing with composition, that kind of thing, different styles of photography. So they're the kind of things that I'm going to talk about in this podcast. So the very first thing I recommend you think about, which is really a no-brainer, but it's very easy to miss it in the heat of the moment, is to just make sure that your camera lens on the phone is clean. You've wiped it. So what I tend to do, because I wear spectacles, because I wear glasses, I have a little vial thing of cleaning fluid, and it's in a little plastic container thing with a microfiber cloth, and I'll often use that because I use it to clean my glasses. Frankly, I'll use it to clean the lens on my camera as well, because I use a neutral density filter on my camera lenses to stop the lenses getting scratched, because they're pretty expensive lenses. So I find that cleaning fluid is fine, and it's something that you may well have around. If not, it's very easy to get from an optician, somewhere like that. So do think about that. And then it's a very simple thing to have in a bag, maybe even in your pocket, but just give the lens a clean at least every now and again, because it is very easy to get your fingers on the lens when it's in your pocket, in your bag, when you're reaching for it, all those kind of things. So that would be the very first thing and the simplest thing to do. The next thing is to get familiar with the lenses on your camera. So most cameras these days have more than one lens. So often one of them will be a wide angle, one of them will be a kind of standard lens, which would be what would have been on the phones really from the start when they started to put cameras in phones. And then the other one's likely to be a telephoto. Now, what those actually do will depend on the camera that you have, the smartphone that you have. What I do recommend is to use the different lenses where you can, particularly if you're zooming in to a particular subject. And the reason is that you want to use optical zoom where you can, because that will tend to keep the resolution relatively high on the image. Now, depending on the camera you have, the chances are that your smartphone is not going to be producing images to the same resolution, so the same amount of detail in the photograph that your DSLR or your mirrorless camera is going to do. So you really want to make sure you stack the odds a little bit in your favor by just understanding what the lenses are, how to select them, and just play with them, see what you get with taking photographs of the same subject from the same spot, but using the different lenses. Now, another thing that's basic on the camera itself is to just understand a couple of things, because most smartphone cameras, they're kind of used in auto mode, like you just use auto in your DSLR. And I'm guessing if you've got an interest in photography, you're probably not using auto that much, if at all. So it's good to know how to get out of that on the smartphone. So there's a couple of things, and these are focus and exposure. And the way that you handle both is when you've got your phone held up, you're looking at your subject, just tap the subject that you want to be the point of focus on the phone. Just tap it on the screen. And what you should see is either circle or a square appear around on that piece of the screen that you've just tapped. So ideally that would be your subject. Often what will happen, if next to that circle or square, if you then put your finger on the phone and move it up or down, that should change the exposure. So by tapping, you've actually set the focal point. You've also selected the point that you want to expose correctly. And then by just sliding next to that circle or square, that should allow you to change the exposure on that point. So if you haven't done that before, do have a go. It might be different on your phone. I'm not sure if this is the same across all makes of phone. So you might need to just check on the camera manual or go online and see how to set that on your own phone. But it does mean that rather than being in auto all the time, you now have creative control over what you're doing with your smartphone. So that is something that I do recommend that you do. Okay, so I think that's most of it on the phone. The other thing I would say, just as a general point, is to avoid flash photography where possible. So I quite often turn the flash off in the menu settings on the phone, particularly if I'm working with wildlife or I'm trying to do something at night. So I've also found that smartphone cameras often have very good low light performance. And in fact, with an older DSLR that I had, an older Canon, I actually found my iPhone at the time was better in low light than than this really expensive camera. So it does depend what you're using, obviously, but in that situation, particularly as I say, if you're in wildlife, shooting wildlife or somewhere where you don't really want to disturb what's going on, I would try and turn the flash off if you can. That obviously won't work in all situations. You might need a bit of extra light, but that's the recommendation. And the other thing on the camera, while I'm just thinking about it, is also be aware that you can most likely use a different shutter button, let's say. So usually on the phones I've used, and I don't know what you're using and what yours is like, there is a circular button at the bottom of the screen that you press, and that's your shutter, and that takes the photo. But you can generally, and again, I think this is on most phones, use either the up or the down arrow. So if you're holding the phone, say, on the ground, and you can't get down to actually see what the screen's doing, or it's not comfortable to hit that default button on the screen, you can usually use the up or the down arrow and just press on that. Some cameras as well have a floating shutter button that you can select. So just have a look at the camera menu, the options available on your phone, and that might be useful. I do have that on the Samsung I use, but I to be honest, I don't tend to use it very much, because if I can use the shutter on the phone, on the screen, use the shutter button on the screen, generally I can use the standard one. So to me, that's not so useful, but you might find it's a real boon for the kind of photography you're doing. So that's really the technical side on the camera. The next thing to think about is composition. So I'm going to mention rule of thirds, because another thing that you may well find when you look at the menu for your camera is the option to select a grid, and this may even be a default for you. And one of the grids you're going to have is the rule of thirds grid. And what that is, if you don't know about rule of thirds, it's simply 4 lines, 2 of them vertical, 2 of them horizontal. And those lines respectively split the screen into vertical thirds and also into horizontal thirds. So you end up with 9 rectangles on the screen, all the same size. And the way to use that is to put your subject either on one of the 4 points where those lines cross. So if you look at that screen, once you've found that, there are 4 points where the lines cross over, or place the subject on one of those lines. And the reason for doing that is that it basically gets your subject off center. Most people don't think too much about composition, in my experience. Certainly people who aren't really serious about the photography. So the kind of snapshot, I guess, is what I would have called it years ago. So usually with them, the subject is right in the middle of the screen, but you can get great effects by making use of the space in the screen. So having your subject off to one side creates space in the photograph. Now, some people call that negative space because it's unused. I don't particularly like that term because to me it implies it isn't really useful, whereas I think it is. How you use space in a composition can make the difference between an ordinary image and a very powerful one. So there is a real skill to it, and it's something that you can only really get on top of by practicing. And if you don't really know what I'm talking about, have a look at photographs maybe on Instagram or in books, wherever you get your inspiration, and just look at how the subject is positioned in the frame. I've even noticed this on TV series. Often when somebody is talking, they do a kind of head and shoulders shot of somebody, but they'll often be right over one side of the screen or the other. And there's a lot of space behind them. Quite often it's behind them actually, or in front of them. And when you look at a photograph like that, think about where that's taking your mind in terms of how you're interpreting that scene. If there's a lot of space behind the subject, it suggests to anybody looking that something is either happening or about to happen or has just happened in that area behind the subject. And equally, that could be applied to past and future. So it's a bit creative. If you're not creative, don't worry about it. But it is a fun thing to play with, and it can make your photographs look a lot more interesting. So that's definitely a hot tip. Make use of the space within the frame, and don't just think about your subject. Think about what's going on around them. If there's nothing going on around them, what can you have in that space that will draw the viewer's eye into the space to have a look at it and then come back to your subject? So obviously how you handle the focus and what's out of focus is an important aspect of that. Okay, so I'm going to talk about types of photograph because these are all very relevant using a smartphone. And one of the reasons is that if you're standing there holding a smartphone, people will ignore you because, you know, how many times you walk down the street and there's phone zombies here and there. But a lot of people, when you walk down the street, are on their phone. They might be having it to their ear. A lot of them will be looking at it. Some will be holding it up. So if you're using a phone, you don't stand out. So it's great for things like candid photography where you're trying to not intrude at all. Ideally, the subject doesn't even know you're there. So the very natural unposed photographs, or things like street photography where you want to get the kind of natural view of what's going on rather than become a focus yourself. And obviously, if you're standing there with a really big DSLR camera in a street or at an event, it might be a wedding or something else, it's really hard to take candids unless you're very, very good at being unobtrusive, which again takes a lot of practice. So smartphone cameras really do lend themselves to that kind of photography. Now, other things to think about are reflections and also symmetry. So I'm going to talk about abstract a little bit, but I'll mention symmetry here because that's where reflections tend to come in. Our eyes are naturally drawn to things that are symmetrical. And if you think about it, if you look at models, people like that, where in a lot of cases, let's say, because you could be modeling all sorts of things, but the sort of more glamorous modeling, people who have more symmetrical faces tend to look more attractive to us. And I think that's a general rule. So subconsciously, at least, we get drawn to symmetrical images. So when you're walking about, have a look at what's symmetrical, and you can find symmetry in lots of different places. You can find it in buildings with windows, you can doors. You can often find symmetrical patterns in paving stones. If you have these sort of herringbone patterns, you can set a shot up so that you've got symmetry in that image. It is something that once you start looking, you begin to find a lot of them, and it's something to think about. Now, this can get quite abstract, but equally, some of the photographs I've taken of wildlife, where some of the favourite ones are where I've been able to make use of water, and I'm particularly thinking of a photograph I took of a solitary elephant that was walking on the opposite bank to where I was, next to a river. But because this elephant was right next to the bank, I had the reflection of the bank and the elephant in the water, and that made great shots. So the way to use symmetry is to have that dividing line either splitting the frame in half horizontally or splitting it in half vertically, but that gives you a really good symmetrical image. Now, reflections are another thing to look for, and obviously rivers, lakes, the ocean. If you're lucky, if it's really flowing, a really flat calm, you can get very good symmetrical images. But something else very good reflections, I should say. But something you can do just to manufacture your own reflections is to carry a water bottle. So if it's a hot day, I generally have a water bottle with me anyway, just because I get thirsty. But if you have a water bottle and maybe take some extra water with you, if just check the alignment, look at what you want to photograph and where the reflection needs to be, and then just take your bottle and pour water on the ground. Obviously, it depends on, it needs to be reasonably smooth so that the water isn't getting absorbed too quickly, or else obviously you'll just have a wet patch of ground with no reflections. But look for, paving is good, anything like that, anything that's solid, relatively solid, and we'll let the water stay there for a little while. So also decking and things like that can be used, although that will disappear within a few minutes. You might have to be pretty quick on your feet to get the shot. But do remember that if there isn't a convenient source of reflections nearby, and that could also be shop windows, restaurant windows, plate glass window, anything like that, do remember that if you carry water, you can just create a source of reflections without needing anything else there. So do keep a lookout for that one. Now, I have mentioned abstract a little bit. So I guess in the context of what I mentioned, this is getting symmetry. That would kind of be patterns, and the kind of things I've been talking about are really patterns. So it is a good idea to look at what patterns you can see in front of you and think of how you use them. Now, another thing that I haven't mentioned, this probably really falls into the composition side, but it's leading lines, because quite often there are objects that are in the frame that can lead the viewer's eye through the frame and towards your subject. And a definition that I heard a few years ago now, but I really like it, is that a good way to judge how successful an image is how long somebody spends looking at it. What's the journey that you can take a viewer on through your photograph? So this is why some photographers will tilt the camera slightly so that everything isn't square to the sides of the image, that it's just tilted by a few degrees. But then you've got this, it creates a point of interest, because we don't normally see things tilted. Normally when we look at things, we like to be, vertically aligned, horizontally aligned. That's generally how we'll do things. However, if you put some tilt in there, it looks unusual. And again, it will draw the eye to the photograph, so that our brain can, maybe our subconscious can work out exactly what is going on in that image. So think about that. Think about symmetry, but also think about deliberately making things non-symmetrical. And you can use leading lines. Often there will be patterns of, it might be trees, it could be bollards. One of my favourite spots in Sydney at the Rocks, it was... there was a bench by the side of the road, just a normal wooden slatted bench. But if you put the camera or your phone, rested it on the slats of the bench, and then just shot down the length of the bench towards the subject that was there, you could see the lines at the slats of the bench actually led the viewer's eye from the foreground towards the subject. So once you begin to think about it, you can find leading lines everywhere. So tram tracks are great, railway tracks are great, as long as, make sure nothing's coming. Even standing on a road where you've got lines on the road, again, don't be silly about it, but there are lots of sources of parallel lines that you can use as leading lines to draw the viewer into the image, and then how you use them, how low down you get with your camera, how acute an angle you have those lines at is really up to you. You can experiment with that and see what works. So this does start to go into the abstract, as I said. And what do I mean by that? It's really unusual perspectives. Abstract, to me, is looking at objects that might be seen daily, perhaps, but looking at them or photographing them in such a way that the viewer looks at them again and maybe sees them in a different way, maybe sees something new about them, or even you just draw their attention. It kind of looks familiar, but they can't quite put the finger on why it looks familiar, and it may be something that they see every day. So abstract can be great fun, and it's one of the things I used to do when I was doing photo walks in Sydney. I'd be shooting the same place every week or two with people. I'd take them on different walks, but essentially within a limited area. So you're walking past the same places all the time, and every now and again I'd be lacking a little bit of inspiration, and which isn't good when you're kind of leading a photo group, because you want to give people ideas all the time. So one of the things I would always do is just put the camera on the ground and just take a shot on the ground, wide angle, take a shot and see what I got. And so that new perspective, being down at ground level, a kind of insect's eye view, if you like, gives a completely different perspective on a scene that if you took standing up, the way everybody else, or the way you would normally look at it, the way they're looking at it, it would be nothing. So that was one of the things I used to do, but you can use different angles. So I've already mentioned tilting the phone slightly when you take a photograph, getting really close to your subject. So, photograph things up close that you would normally look at from a distance, because again, you might even have people asking what it is because it looks really cool. And people can be very surprised at just everyday things they wouldn't give a second look to. If you go in very close to them or find a different angle for them, suddenly you've got a really interesting photograph, and it's a photograph that people would walk past hundreds, thousands of times a day maybe and not even see it. So this is really where going a little bit abstract, thinking outside the box a little bit, can be fun. Even if you don't do anything with the photos, you might just pop them on social media, or you could do a project with them. It's completely up to you. So other things, or one other idea with the abstract, is to look for solid colors and how you make use of them. So it may just be a single color. It may be, 90% of the image is a solid color with something else in there. And that can give you a contrast. It can give you a different perspective again. But just think about those kind of ideas. And again, if you're short of ideas, I love Instagram, because you can do a hashtag abstract, and I haven't tried this, so I don't actually know what that will come up with. But if you try that, you should hopefully get a lot of different images up that are other people's ideas of abstract photography, and that's how they've tagged them. And in there may be lots and lots of ideas that you can apply and play with and experiment and put your own spin on them. So I don't think there's anything wrong with copying other people's ideas at all. I mean, this is how we grow. You can think of it as inspiration. We get inspired by what somebody else is doing, but we want to put our own spin on it. And this is one of the beauties of photography in being able to do that. Okay, so one other thing that I'm going to mention, if you are doing wildlife and you don't have a really big lens, but I've seen a number of people do this. If you've got some binoculars, one thing you can do, and it can be a bit fiddly, but you can do it, is to find your subject, but just put the phone's camera up against the eyepiece of the binoculars. Obviously, you're looking at the screen on the back. It might be a bit tricky holding it all, but there you go. But it is a way of essentially getting a nice, good optical telephoto that, if you've already got the gear, it doesn't cost you anything to have it, but it is a good way of getting those close-up animal shots if that's the only option you've got. The very last thing I'm going to talk about is editing. Now, I make no secret of the fact that all of the images that I put up are edited. It's extremely rare for me to put up something, and this is social media or certainly printed photographs, are all edited and through several packages. I've spoken about that in different places, so you may have heard that. Generally, I find what the camera sees is often not what I'm seeing with my eye. And that's because we have a really good visual system of our own, our eye and our brain, our eyes and our brain. And our optical system, if you like, does all sorts of adjustments without us thinking about it. So we adjust for light levels, for example, and things like that, and shadows and backlighting and all that sort of thing. So the camera doesn't. So it's quite likely that when you look at your photograph, it's not going to look quite right. You might have a stunning sunset, but when you look at it on the camera, it looks pretty flat. One thing you can do, which might help, and I've used this before, is, again, it's a little trick. If you're holding the camera in a landscape format, just try keeping your subject where you want it in the screen, so within the image, but tilt the camera back, tilt the phone back. So you might have to readjust your focus, but by tilting back, sometimes that increases the contrast of the image so that the image you've shot starts to look has a lot more impact, starts to look a lot more like what you're seeing. However, if that may or may not work, depending on what you're using, it's due to the way the camera works in a smartphone. It's slightly different to certainly DSLRs. It's based on a different technology. Having said all that, though, there are plenty of editing packages available for the phone. Some phones have their own editing software built in. With others, you can get, say, Adobe Lightroom and Photoshop available for your phone, but they're generally subscription. But have a look at what you've got on the phone, because it makes sense to use what you've got and not pay for anything else. And have a look at what's available freely. If that doesn't do quite what you want, or you're not happy with the results from the standard software, then by all means have a look at what else is available. So I'm not going to recommend anything. That things do change, and I don't know how long people will be listening to this podcast, but it's always worth checking on what the latest thing is, and maybe even doing googling some reviews to see how different people have found different packages. Okay, and that is pretty much it. So I hope you found that useful. The bottom line on this is that smartphones are very capable cameras. So pretty much everyone walks around with a very good camera in their pocket. But I think it's fair to say the majority of people don't make full use of them, and maybe even don't realize that they can shoot some really good photographs with their smartphone. And essentially the smartphone these days has really killed what used to be the compact camera market. So going back 10, 15 years, you'd be able to get these smaller compact cameras you just have in your pocket. But smartphone cameras are so good these days that I think that there will still be cameras about, I'm sure. But the most users of those cameras, I'm sure, I would hope, particularly if they bought a very expensive smartphone, will be making use of the capabilities of the smartphone. So please don't forget that you have it. I hope you found some of these tips useful, and I'll talk to you again in the next podcast. Bye for now. Oh, and one thing just before you go, please take a look at the 2026 wildlife calendar. That's available now. It's on the website. There's a link below the description of this podcast episode. So please take a look, and I'll speak to you next time. Bye now.